All right, well, I want to thank you so much for making me feel so welcome. And I will take my time so that you can do your translation. Thank you for that. What I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about myself and how I came to this work. I'll tell you a little bit about the progression of our research on consciousness transformation, and we'll explore that handout together. And I want to have the opportunity to pause and invite any conversation with you as we move along. So I know that sometimes, I can keep talking, so I invite us to talk together. And then I will tell you a little bit about some of the current work that I'm involved in that deals with consciousness transformation. But before we start, I thought if it's appropriate and all right with you, that I could lead a very short meditation that comes, it's in our book, the Living Deeply book, and this is from the introduction by Robert Thurman, who some of you may know, who is a Buddhist scholar and somebody whose work I am very appreciative of. So I just invite you to take a deep breath and to center yourself. And I would invite you to imagine yourself in a space capsule with Edgar Mitchell, who was the Apollo 14 astronaut. You're there in the vastness of outer space. You see all the stars shining majestically, unobscured by lights from any cities. You look down and see something that looks like a round, opalescent, glistening, shining jewel. You can see the blue of the oceans, the white of the clouds, the brown streaks of the deserts, the gray mountaintops, and the green of the jungles and forests. And of course, you're with the astronaut, so you're hoping you're going to get safely back to planet Earth. You're having a vision of the unity of life on the planet. You may also be aware simultaneously that there are an infinite number of such jewels in the universe. But this is yours, your home. It is also the home of 6 billion other human beings and many trillions of other life forms. As you look, you feel a wonderful sense of oneness and togetherness with all those beings living on this thin, delicate film, on the surface of molten rock, under a thin layer of air, like the fuzz on a peach. As you look down on this jewel, you have a little tinge of sorrow about the foolish people who are destroying the basis of life on this planet. It doesn't frighten you too much, though, for you realize that there must be some degree of wisdom, generosity, love, and compassion to match the beauty of Mother Earth, Mother Gaia. From this perspective of deep space, you may then do what other Buddhists call offering the mandala. By mandala, they mean the whole of the protected zone, wherein life, mind, and spirit can thrive. You notice that there's an element in you that is possessive about this planet. In a way, even your own mind has a little element of what those foolish people who try to conquer and exploit life have in them. You may become aware that sometimes you too feel like you own the place. And yet you realize from that capsule in deep space that no one owns it. You can then imagine that you pick up the entire planet very gently in your hands and you give it away. you give it to the deities or the gods. If you don't believe in any of that, you give it to the enlightened beings. You give it away to wisdom. You detach yourself from a sense of ownership, and as you do this, you realize you are a guest, and you realize that this ultimate generosity is the basis of true happiness. Thank you. And I appreciate your generosity, and Raymond and Priscilla for inviting me here. Very grateful to be with you. So I'll tell you a little bit about my own history. I came to this pursuit of consciousness probably before I can even remember. I was 18 months old, precocious, creative, inquisitive, and in all of that, I did what any good 18-month-old will do, which is explore the world around them. And what I found was a can of lighter fluid that my father had mindlessly left on the table. And so I put that can of lighter fluid in my mouth and ended up for 3 months in and out of intensive care in the hospital, struggling for life. And I think in that moment, I felt the call for healing. I understood that there was this capacity that people were bringing to me to help nurture me and to help me to survive. When I was 16, I was the passenger on the back of a motorcycle, and we were hit by a drunk driver. And I remember very clearly watching my body tumbling through the air. And I had this kind of out-of-body experience where suddenly I became aware that perhaps who I was, my identity, was something more than just my physical. But then I crashed onto the ground and I discovered my embodiment, and it hurt. And there were 66 stitches, ultimately in my leg. And at that time, in the emergency room of the hospital, they talked about maybe amputating my leg because the cut was so severe. And I went home and I had a cast from my hip all the way to my ankle. And I lay on the couch in my family's living room. And for some reason, somehow, I had this idea that if I could just visualize my body healing, that perhaps my wound would heal and perhaps it would be okay. And I honestly don't know where that idea came from. I'm going to say it came to me noetically. And noetic is a word that means direct knowing. So intuitively, somehow, I had this feeling that if I visualized my immune system, my body would heal. And indeed, I can remember like the little tingles in my leg as my body was healing and mending itself. And so I think that was the beginnings of my awareness, first of all, from the motorcycle accident, of this idea of consciousness as something more than just embodiment. And that we have these powers and potentials within us to harness our consciousness, to heal ourselves, and to help heal each other. So at that time, I was living in Detroit, Michigan. It was during the sort of 60s and 70s that I was growing up, and it was a time when the world, and certainly this country, was at war with itself. And it was a class war and a race war. It was a worldview war. And as a young teenager, I felt very unempowered. And I felt the kind of suffering that we heard about in the meditation, where there was this longing to help make the world a better place, but no sense that I knew how. So it wasn't until I got into college at Wayne State University in downtown Detroit that I discovered 2 books. And the first was called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and it was written by Thomas Kuhn. And that book truly changed my life. It liberated me because what it said is that this model of reality that we live in isn't fixed or absolute, and that in fact, even in science, where we think that there is this sense of, what is truth? Scientists are proving what is true. They prove stuff, right? But even in the area of science, if you look at the history, you see that our paradigms, our models of worldview, our models of reality have changed over time. And so even something like our sense of what science tells us is absolutely true has changed. Even the notion that the Earth is the center of the universe in the Copernican revolution was overthrown by the idea that the sun is the center of the universe and our little planet revolves around it. So that book was very important to me. It really helped me to see that I was living in a worldview and that this paradigm defined a lot of what everybody around me believed and how they behaved. The second book that I read was called Psychic Explorations. And it was written by Edgar Mitchell, the Apollo 14 astronaut that this meditation centered around. And in that book, it was a collection of scientists who were coming together to do research on these powers and potentials of consciousness. And the idea that, again, perhaps our identity isn't just tied to our embodiment. And that scientists were doing rigorous, disciplined research to try and understand the reaches of our mind and our consciousness. So things like telepathy, mind-to-mind communication, or precognition, the idea that somehow we may be able to know the future, were all things that people were studying. And I was so excited by that and wanted to be part of what I saw as a revolution. And so I started, and I began to do experimental research. I studied these kinds of extended capacities. And then I got called into healing. And I remember now, that experience as an 18-month-old. I think that ultimately was very formative for me. And so I started looking at different healing traditions and actually studied briefly with the Yoshi-Dandan, have had the privilege of being with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, have been to China and met with masters from Qigong and a variety of different subtle energies. And so I have grown over the years to have a deep appreciation for the multiple different healing traditions and the idea that healing isn't just about the body, it's about our spirit, and it's about our relationships to one another. And so I ended up getting a PhD in anthropology, where I was able to study different cultural traditions and belief systems. And I also was doing this kind of laboratory-based research, so I was straddling worldviews. On the one hand, working in a controlled environment where we're attempting to manipulate the variables and look at outcomes. And on the other hand, through anthropology, to be able to appreciate lived experience and how our cultures shape who we are. And that we often are embedded in a worldview that we can't even see. And that there are different ways that those worldviews express themselves. So that was, the beginnings for my career. And I had the privilege then of completing my graduate work, coming out to California, and working in the psychology department at Stanford University. And there I was really able to begin to marry my quantitative research with my qualitative research, the study of healing, the study of consciousness. And I also had another postdoc at the same time at a cognitive sciences laboratory at a big international think tank called Science Applications International Corporation. And we were sponsored by the government, the Defense Department. It was the CIA, DIA sponsored program to study these extended capacities. And the government grant ran out, and I got renewed at Stanford, but it wasn't enough to really live in Northern California. And one day the phone rang, and it was just at the time when I was kind of contemplating, what do I do next? Where do I go? I was going to go to Europe. I had a couple of job offers there. And the phone rang, and it was the CEO of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And he invited me to come and be the director of research. And that was that's 20 years ago now. And so I took that job after some trepidation. And in that process, have had the opportunity to do a lot of very interesting work. So I'll just pause for a second. You're good? You're fast. Thank you. Are there any questions or comments before? Because now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Institute of Noetic Sciences and some of the history. So IONS was founded during this moment when Edgar Mitchell was traveling through space. He had had the opportunity and the privilege to be part of the Apollo space program. And he actually walked on the moon. He was one of those few handful of people who had that experience. And he describes the epiphany moment for him, the big opening, not during his moonwalk, but actually on the trip home. And he had the window seat, as he described it. So imagine sitting in this little tin can, hurling through space at this extraordinary speed. And they did what was called the barbecue rotation. So the Apollo capsule was rotating as it was entering the Earth's orbit. And he had the chance then to see the moon rise and set, the Earth rise and set, and the sun rise and set, over and over again, every time the capsule rotated. And he describes having had two experiences in that epiphany. And the first, as Bob Thurman points out, there was this sense of suffering. As he looked down at this beautiful planet Earth, it was complete. It was pristine. It was whole. There were no national boundaries or state boundaries or race boundaries or gender boundaries, ethnic boundaries, religious boundaries. There was none of that. And what he realized in that moment is that the cause of suffering isn't something out there, isn't something inherent in planet Earth, but really something about us, inhabitants of planet Earth, who carry this worldview and this frame of consciousness that defines our experience. So that was the first part of his epiphany, is recognizing that there is this wholeness and this completeness, and that we create the suffering through our own practices and our beliefs and our worldviews. The second part of his epiphany was of unity. And as he looked at the Earth, the sun, and the moon rotating over and over again, he realized that the molecules in his body were connecting him to the molecules in the solar system, and even the Big Bang itself. And that there is this sense of interconnectedness and fundamental unity. And that gave him a real sense of joy. And so when he came back to planet Earth, he realized that perhaps the great exploration isn't outer space, but inner space. And that perhaps if we could take the same rigor and discernment that we had put into the Apollo program and begin to apply it to our own inner space, that we could shift our model and begin to become more compassionate, loving, forgiving, caring people. And that was now 40 years ago, the Institute of Noetic Sciences just celebrated its 40th anniversary last week. And during that time then, there have been a lot of different kinds of efforts to reconcile science and wisdom, science and spirituality. He describes the Noetic Sciences as Buddhism was the original Noetic science, because it really does have this discipline and focus on understanding. And so I've had the privilege of leading research programs on the science of meditation, for example. We have the largest bibliography online of the science of meditation, looking at different traditions, looking at different belief systems, everything from psychological research to immunological research and even the sociology of meditation. The project I most want to talk about right now, though, is the study of consciousness transformation. And that's what we did this book, Living Deeply, about. And what I realized in terms of my own history is that because I came with this passion around healing and around consciousness, that perhaps we could begin to invite in a kind of consciousness transformation that would help to heal the wounds that Edgar Mitchell identified. And so about 15 years ago, I started a research project where, first of all, we looked in the medical and scientific literature to see how people were studying shifts in consciousness, transformations in consciousness. People report these experiences like I had of this out-of-body state, or these exalted states of gratitude or wonder. And oftentimes people describe the experience as something they discovered. There was some transformation for them where they went from being completely defined by their physical characteristics and properties, and instead defined by these extended capacities and this unity of consciousness. And so when we looked in the scientific and medical literature, we saw that mostly these states were considered pathological. In other words, the scientists and the psychiatric literature described these things as psychosis or certainly neurosis. They didn't see it as something amazing and wonderful. And so the opportunity to begin to really look at the positive qualities of consciousness transformation became very, very compelling to me. So we started interviewing people who teach consciousness transformation and invited them to come in and help us to understand how we could study this. And then we engaged in a very painstaking project, interviewing 60 masters who represented different world traditions, and asked them, what is consciousness? And what is consciousness transformation? And how would you study it? And what are the right questions to be asking? And so that led to a long process where we collected and analyzed, and every interview was subjected to 2 independent judges looking point by point at the details. And then we were able to formulate a survey out of that where we administered it to 2,000 people who weren't the masters, weren't the people who had, actually gone and lived in a cave for 10 years, but people who are just getting on with their life day by day. And we looked to see were there qualities that the 2 populations shared. And ultimately, we've done some other longitudinal research, but that's what led to this change model. And so the handout is really what I want to focus on right now, and just begin to explore what we learned from this long and arduous process, and how much it has implications, not only for our individual growth and development, but for social transformation, for each of us becoming agents of positive change in the world. And there are different change models. You can think about change happening from the top down. You know, people make laws that say you have to wear seatbelts. Suddenly, people are wearing seatbelts because the law enforced it. It was imposed on us. But there's also this quality of transformation that comes within us. It comes from these kind of noetic experiences. And again, noetic is those deep insights that we have that are very personal to us. What we discovered is that these noetic experiences can be catalysts. They can help to trigger people's transformative journey. And so, what defines a noetic experience? What triggers these transformative moments? Well, the first thing we discovered is it can be anything. People described all kinds of things. They described, perhaps it was the possibility that they had a death in the family, or a personal illness, or the loss of a job, a divorce, something that destabilized them and caused them to question their assumptions and their worldview. And so we began to look at what were these triggers. We heard from a Vietnam vet who actually described his transformative moment when he was in the battlefield watching his colleagues being gunned down. We heard from a mom who had a sick child and felt that if they could lay hands on the child, that the child would be healed. And in fact, that's what happened. So we found there were many things. And so as you look at this change model and you see that it's kind of positioned in the Fibonacci spiral, which is an ancient form that is found all through nature. So these noetic experiences can be catalytic, and they can cause us to reflect on what we assume to be true about reality. They cause us to reflect on our worldview. But we can deny those experiences. We can say, whatever that opening was a delusion for us. And in fact, for some people, they become more entrenched in the belief system that they had and less willing to explore the possibilities of their consciousness. But if people engage the transformative process, they can begin to look at exploring the world in a new way, with new eyes, and that kind of beginner's mind that we talk about. It's a way of engaging. And I think that there are many practices and programs that can help us to explore these openings that we've had. So we notice also that there's a shadow side to exploration. People can get caught up in the exploring and the constant desire to be stimulated, and maybe never really come home to that deep transformative experience that shifts our awareness. So there's always these different sides to these experiences. On the one hand, the potentials for our growth and our development, and on the other hand, this idea that we can, if not careful, become rigid. The next piece of the change model, the transformational model that we identified, was practice. And the masters all told us that they felt practice was essential to grounding these noetic experiences, to truly living into transformations in consciousness. But in this study, we interviewed people from many different practices. And so, what does it mean to have a practice? We talked to pagans who were interested in worshiping nature. We talked to Catholic priests. We interviewed many Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, atheists. What we found in common was the idea that there are 4 elements, and I'm going to say there's a 5th. There are 4 elements of a transformative practice. The first element that we found across these different traditions was the idea of intention. So we know that we are capable of setting our intention and directing our efforts toward a particular goal. But we also know there's the old adage, the road to hell is paved with good intention. And intention alone can slip us up. There's a lot of really interesting research now in the cognitive neurosciences looking at intention and the role that intention plays in our own relationship to ourselves and in our relationship to one another. So intention is important. It directs us. It gets our bodies here. It gets us to our feet planted on the floor in the mornings when we wake up and we begin our day. And we know that it's important, but alone not enough. The second element of these transformative practices is attention. Where do we place our attention? And again, looking at the cognitive neurosciences, we know that there's something called inattentional blindness. Our culture seeps us in a worldview that gives us expectations about what we're going to see in the world around us. And what we discover is that our expectations about the world shape what we see. And our attention can actually be constrained by the model of reality that we're holding. And that it's only when we begin to become aware of what we're not aware of and begin to shift our attention so that it can allow us more flexibility and fluidity that we can begin to really cultivate this transformative approach to consciousness. So the third piece of the practices that we found was repetition. So when you do your meditation practice, doing it again and again helps us to become more fluid, to become more facile, to be able to move with greater ease. And so, again, looking at what science is telling us today, we know that our brains lay down these neural pathways. So it's kind of like if you're in the snow and your skis are in a groove. Your skis are going to want to follow that groove. It's kind of hard to get out of it unless you make a real effort. Well, our brains are like that. So the repetitive activities that we do day in and day out lay down these neural pathways in our brains that make it hard for us to see things in a different way. So those become the repetitive actions, whether they're functional or dysfunctional, healing or pathological. What we also know from neuroscience today is what's called neuroplasticity. The fact that our brains, even though they have these grooves, are capable of changing. And that through meditation, through transformative practice, through loving kindness, through activities that we repeat over and over, we can reprogram our brains in ways that become much more life-affirming and much more sustainable. So that's the third piece, the third element of the transformative practices that we identified. The fourth was guidance. And in this, 99.9% of the people we interviewed felt that it's important to have a teacher. It's like if you go to the gym and you're working out your muscles, if you're holding the weights wrong, you can actually be working the wrong muscle group. And so by having someone who's been on the path before you, it can help to navigate and help us to course correct. We also know that guidance isn't only from outside. It's not all about an authority figure who tells us what to do. It's really beginning to cultivate those noetic qualities of our inner knowing to begin to train our consciousness so that the guidance comes from within us and we can begin to calibrate for ourselves the path forward. So these four principles, intention, attention, repetition, and guidance, become fundamental kind of cornerstones to a transformative practice. And I like to say that I see these four qualities wrapped in the arms of surrender. Because ultimately, transformations in consciousness aren't about our efforts to just affect change out there, but really come when we surrender to what is so and begin to work with that sense of possibility, just as it is, in all its supreme wonder and beauty. So those are the qualities of the transformative practice. And then the question, so we looked at triggers. What leads to these transformations in consciousness? The majority of those triggers came from some kind of painful experience, but not entirely. We saw that people can begin to engage in different ideas and ways of knowing by exploring the world, by considering different truth systems, by recognizing their own worldview. And that ultimately grounding them in some kind of practice allows people to begin to build new habits, new ways of being in themselves and with one another. But then so what? Where does this lead us? And what we saw is that people begin to identify a core ego shift. And it's a move from a me to a we. So again, if we want to look at the shadow side of practice, people can get very righteous about their practice. And my practice is the right practice, and the way I'm doing it is the way it's going to be done. And what the teachers told us over and over again is that you actually need to move from the pillow or the pew and out into the world. And that it's a move from a me to a we. And how we begin to engage that kind of collective consciousness and our collaboration in the co-creation of something else becomes really vital. But that has a shadow side as well. And so as we begin to think about this move from the me, which can be characterized by narcissism and over self-indulgence, to this shift to the we can forget about the me. We can forget that we need to have a healthy individuation in order to really be successful in engaging in that collective enterprise, which is the we. And so really looking at how people can begin to move in a way that is healthy for themselves, articulating a particular way of being, and then recognizing our shared humanity and our shared connection and interconnection to all of life in the same way that the meditation that we started with allowed us to contemplate, and which I'm sure your practice is defined by. And one of the reasons I'm so grateful to be here, I think just being in this room and with all of you, it has such a sense of beauty. And I think that it is about not only our own personal growth and development, but our shared experience of all that happens for life. And so that brings us to the idea of living deeply. And how do we really begin to imbue our life in every moment, even when it hurts, even when there's suffering, with this sense of possibility? Brother David Stendelrast is a Benedictine monk and one of the masters that we interviewed. He does gratefulness meditation. And so he describes how there was this experience he had of going to Africa and discovering his deep gratitude for clean drinking water. And so when he came home and he turned on the tap in his house, he felt this overwhelming sense of gratitude. Clean drinking water. Something that we all take for granted if we live in a culture that has public health and, good sewer systems. And what he discovered is that a couple days into being home and turning on the tap, he found himself forgetting. He forgot to be grateful for the clean drinking water. And so one of the things we've seen in this research is how important community is, and how important it is that we have these reminders of our greatness and our potential and our sense of interconnectedness. I had a personal experience when I was in the middle of doing this research. My son, who, as we know, is certainly my great teacher, and in all kinds of ways, he's 14. At this point, he was, 8, and we were driving to his violin lesson. And there was a woman in the middle of the road, and she had a dog in one hand and a dog carrier in the other, and she was weaving in and out of traffic. And she was stopping everything. And I found myself thinking, what is wrong with this woman? And then I remembered all of this insight that I had gotten from these amazing teachers. And I thought, something is wrong with this woman. And as soon as I made that shift from reactiveness to compassion, I couldn't hold the reactiveness anymore. And so I like to say that I think road rage is an amazing spiritual practice. It can wake us up. It can help us. And I also think that in that process, having reminders. So going back to Brother David and the water, what he did when he found himself habituating to the gratefulness of the water is he put those little yellow stickum notes all over his house. And so when he saw the stickum note, it reminded him to remember, to do his practice. And then he found himself habituating to the stickum notes. And so he had to move them around. So it's very clear that the transformative process is something that we can slip in and out of, and that we can forget. And as we engage in community, and as we are there to be reminders and support system for one another, it can help us to really manifest the goals that we each have in our own individual process, but also to really support and help one another. So these are kind of the principles that we identified in this change model, and then to begin to think about how do we move from my own individual perspective to thinking about our collective engagement. And there are many, many ways in which we can begin to apply this change model, whether it's in healthcare or education, business, community. There are all kinds of ways that we can begin to take this change model and recognize that each of us as individuals have this calling. And so as we cultivate our practice, we can begin to stimulate that practice in other environments. So for myself, I've done a tremendous amount of work now bringing consciousness into healing, and created a lot of educational programs for nurses, for example. And I'll talk about that at the end here. But the idea that we can begin to work with one health practitioner at a time, who then becomes a kind of fractal that can ignite a kind of transformation in their environment. One place that the next kind of development from this Living Deeply work came when we tried to adapt and have now completed a project where we take these ideas of consciousness transformation and we created a curriculum, and it's now 22 lessons for high school students. And the idea is to invite young people to consider their own consciousness, to consider their worldview. And when I talk about worldview, it's an idea that we see the world through this lens of perception. So when I talked about how our attention is influenced by our culture, we see the world through this lens of perception. And that influences everything that we do. And so helping each of us to understand that that worldview is informed by our culture, by our belief systems, by our family, by our life experience, and that other people have different worldviews. And that there really are qualities and capacities that we can cultivate in ourselves to become more fluid in dealing with diverse perspectives. And in that process, more fluid in dealing with the fact that there are actually multiple ontologies being our models of reality. And that in a certain sense, we have Buddhists and Hindus and Christians and Muslims and atheists who all go to the same grocery stores, they all go to the same schools, they all go to the same hospitals. And so how is it that we're living in this diverse set of models of reality? And that becomes such an opportunity as we're engaging in the 21st century and recognizing all the ways in which these different truth systems are coming together, that if we have skills to navigate those truth systems and qualities that we can bring to our relationships with people whose views of reality are different from our own, then we can begin to heal some of those splits and some of those differences. And so we've taken this model now into public schools and private schools. And we'll be interested sometime in coming back to talk about how some of these principles apply to what we're learning here and what your schools are teaching you. So again, I'll pause. Comments, questions, reflections? I want to talk about one more project, and I have a short video to share with you, and then I would invite some conversation about your own reflections. There are masters here in this room that I feel presumptuous talking about these ideas with. And so to learn from you and to get your calibration on some of this would be very, very helpful to me. But the final project, the project I'm working on right now that I think is kind of the ultimate transformation, is called Death Makes Life Possible. And it's about the idea that different people hold different models of what happens when we die. And that there is something very liberating in our recognition that consciousness can be cultivated in ways that can help us to make our transition. And so I have been actually very interested in this topic for, I'm going to say, more than 30 years now, and have been exploring and looking at the science and the culture, the religions, comparative religions around death. About 3 years ago now, I was co-teaching with Deepak Chopra, who is a spiritual teacher, and he's a physician, somebody who has made a huge impact in our popular culture in helping to bring some of these principles of consciousness into everyday awareness. He was just the CNN correspondent to the Obama inauguration. He's been a great translator. And he said to me, let's make a movie about death and what happens after. And so, at first that sounded like a great idea, sure. And then I got into it, and every project has its layers upon layers upon layers. And so it's been a big undertaking. But we've just about completed a feature film that involves sort of 4 components. We have looked at people who've had mystical noetic experiences that suggest that consciousness extends beyond the body and that we may actually have the capacity to reincarnate or to have an identity that survives bodily death. So we've talked to people, for example, Eben Alexander has a book, it's #1 on the New York Times bestseller list right now. It's called Proof of Heaven. And he is a neuroscientist, he was a neurosurgeon who went into coma and had an experience where he engaged with the angels. And he actually had this sense, from a noetic point of view, that he experienced heaven. And in hearing his story and looking at how his story is touching people all over the world, to a point where this book is a huge bestseller, it's clearly touching other people. It's clearly inviting people to think about their own worldview and their own experiences. So we have interviewed people who have died. There are a couple of people, including Lee Lipsenthal, who had a terminal cancer diagnosis at the time when we did one of the final interviews with him. And he wrote a beautiful book called Enjoy Every Sandwich, where his own experience of dying was one of living and really inviting that fullness of life up to the moment of his death. You'll see a little bit of him in this trailer I'm going to show you. The second group that we interviewed were people from different world traditions. So we talked to people who believe in a heaven, believe in reincarnation. We talked to an atheist who is absolutely sure that when you're dead, you're done, you're gone, period. And so again, trying to find the common elements across these different worldviews and these different belief systems that can help us to understand and alleviate the suffering that people feel, the fear that is expressed by people when they approach this topic of death. And in particular, I've been really influenced by some research on what's called terror management theory. The idea that there is such a huge fear in our culture around death that it leads to all kinds of maladaptive behaviors. And people, according to the theory, if they are threatened and exposed to ideas around death, actually begin to be more hostile toward other people whose views are different from their own. And so this becomes really important as we're thinking about the power that death plays in every aspect of how we live our lives and engage one another. The third group we interviewed were scientists, and we interviewed people from Ian Stevenson's lab at the University of Virginia, who have collected thousands of case reports of reincarnation. Even case reports of children who remember a past life and have some kind of biological marker that ties their physical incarnation to the death of the previous personality. Is it absolutely definitively foolproof? No, it's not, but it's compelling. We're doing an experiment in the lab where I work on mediumship. We've invited mediums, people who believe they can communicate with the spirits, into the laboratory and are actually studying their brains and looking at how their brains shift when they take on these identities. So we've talked also to people like Peter Fenwick, who's a psychiatrist in England, about death experiences and how there are commonalities, not across all people. I mean, there are 6 billion ways to die, 6 billion people. But there are qualities that people report at the point of death, at the moment of death, that are very common. So, for example, the idea that there are family members or loved ones who come to that person at the moment of death or just before and help them to make peace with the transition. And so he systematically collected these case studies, looking at these qualities and experiences that people have had at that moment when they are making that big transformation, big transition. The fourth group that we interviewed were people involved in healing. And so really looking at the possibility that as we come to terms with and invite conversation around death and dying and the afterlife and possibilities that contradict one another, that we can help to heal some of these deep existential wounds that people are experiencing. And we can invite in a different way of engaging our own mortality, and in that process, to really bring a greater sense of joy and possibility. So we have the movie project that I'm hoping we're planning to debut it in July at the IONS conference. We'll then go to London, we'll then go down to another conference. And in that process then, at the same time, there's a book project. I just had an offer for a major publisher who's going to pick up the companion to the book. We're doing a training program, an educational program that is for every person, but we also are focusing part of it on health and healing practitioners. And looking at, it's a 6-week telecourse that we're doing around this conversation. We had the first session last Wednesday, and in the last half hour, we invited these healthcare practitioners to engage in conversation about their own clinical experiences. And I have to say, having been in this field for a long time, it was one of the most moving experiences I've ever had. Listening to one man who has a terminal diagnosis and who is fully excited about the adventure. And listening to people who have, in some ways, begun to really heal their own fears. And it was a beautiful thing. The other piece of this project is a research study. And so right now we're looking at, and we've just submitted some grants and are hoping to get funding to do a project looking at nurses. And nurses who deal with dying patients often have to deal with these diverse worldviews and these different ways of engaging death. And as I said, based on this terror management theory work, they can become very defensive. And so perhaps when they're dealing with somebody whose views very different from their own, maybe they're not bringing the best quality of care they might. if they could deal with their own worldview and their own sense of mortality. And so the idea is to use the film and these educational pieces as an intervention, and we will measure to see if these nurses are happier, healthier, and better citizens as a result of doing this training, and actually looking at changes in their psychological state, their interpersonal state in terms of their relationship to their patients, and ultimately their biology, and looking to see if, in fact, as they begin to become more comfortable, as their level of stress and anxiety goes down, presuming it does, we can actually measure changes in their immune systems. And so it's an exciting undertaking. I think it's really the beginnings of another 10-year project. And so if you'd like to, we can watch. It's a 4-minute trailer. I will say that this trailer was made about a year and a half ago now. And since that time, we have collected hundreds of hours of additional footage. And so the film has really progressed a lot since we did this. But I think it's an opportunity for you to get a little taste of what we're exploring in the movie, and a little feeling for the emotion of it. So if we can go ahead and trigger the PowerPoint. And then again, afterward, I would really invite us to consider a conversation, and I may seed a question or two to get us going.
There's speakers too, right?
Yes.
Okay. Hold on.
We might further inform people through this kind of work. The sign of a true master. They're not speaking with the answers. One of the things we found in the transformation study, going back to the comment, is how do we plant the seeds for transformation? And curiosity, creativity, playfulness, humility, those all become sort of qualities that help us to cultivate our own development and our own expression. Anything from the students? Questions? Some observation? Does this fit with anything you're learning in terms of your curriculum? Have you thought about having a worldview? Do you think about what it means that we make assumptions about the world and that those are informed by something that may be very unique to you?
How would it benefit us if we learned what would happen after death?
Well, I'm going to say, first of all, that I don't think we're going to have a definitive answer to that. And certainly in this film, my goal at the end is to invite people to be asking questions and to begin to reflect on what do they think is important for them. But I think that engaging people in the conversation can, first of all, help. It's kind of a taboo topic in the Western culture. People don't want to talk about it. In fact, Lee has said it beautifully, but death is considered to be a failure. And it's then seen as something that we want to avoid at all costs. And so I feel that by inviting people into a conversation in a kind of open-hearted way can help to reduce the kind of fear that many people have. And I think it could also help us to shift the culture that we're living in. I don't know so much here, you guys have an opportunity to be in a different way of seeing, but certainly when you're in a busy city and everybody's hustling and bustling and there's all these weapons of mass distraction that are pulling us off course, and that model is very pathological. And what we see, for example, in hospitals is the vast majority of money that is spent on healthcare is spent in the last few weeks of a person's life. And it's because people are so fearful of surrendering. And so I feel that being able to have these kinds of conversations and asking these kinds of questions, even if we don't have definitive answers, can really help heal that. So thank you for that question. Another? Or somebody else?
Going back to the talk about practicing, like the fourth intention or third intention, intention as repetition, you would have to practice and get into that groove. Well, I think that kind of, no offense, is easier said than done because for me especially, consistency I think is a big role in practice, and I find it really hard to practice my consistency. So what advice would you say for consistency especially?
If at first you don't succeed, try again. I mean, what do the teachers say? How do you get consistency? I hesitate in front of somebody brilliant minds. I will say that I think part of the practice may be the inconsistency and the learning to navigate through the times when it's not exactly as we predicted it was going to be, because that can lead to a different level of understanding and level of experience. But anybody?
I have a question for you. So, from those interviewees, what have you got? What they saw after they died, after they passed away? What did they see? Did they see God or Buddhas or whatever or heaven?
Well, so one of the things, thank you, beautiful question.
他说访问的那些有过濒死经验的人当中，他们到底看到了些什么？在死亡之后看到了什么？
One of the pieces that we're going to develop is about dreams as preparation for death. And a lot of the people we interviewed felt that this has got to be a multitasking. This is a complex thing you're doing right now, and I appreciate it very much. I really do. So they talked about, lucid dreaming and dream incubation as a way of beginning to prepare ourselves for death. And while many people have a view, many of these people we interviewed felt that it's kind of what you expect to see. This is what you will find. Your dream can be of Buddhas, or it can be of God or Jesus, or not, something else. And that there's something about the preparation, the mental preparation and the practice that can help us to achieve a place where we go to what is ultimately a good space and not a place of suffering. But nobody that we interviewed, well, not nobody, but a lot of the people we interviewed were very open to the idea that their view was not the absolute ultimate only way to go. And that really this idea of dream incubation can really help facilitate it. Another thing we have in this movie that may be a little different from some of the others is art. And so looking at different grief practices, but also looking at preparation for death practices. And so, for example, Farida Bogzarin is a lucid dream scientist and also artist, and she does lucid art. And so she has this project, and we'll show this in the feature film, where she takes big canvases and she fringes them. So in other words, the canvas is made up of threads that are crossing. So she takes a thread and she pulls it very slowly, very mindfully. And it's about impermanence. It's about the space between the threads. It's about the meditative practice of pausing long enough to pull the thread. So these are qualities of a kind of practice that can help people to have less fear, to prepare the inner consciousness, inner space for a positive outcome. one of the things I asked the people on this call last week when we did the first thing in the course of the first session, the topic for the first session was the natural cycle of life. And it isn't about birth and death. Like when people talk about living and dying, all of it is living. All of it is life. It's just the moments between. So birth and death become part of a continuum of living. And so really trying to engage people in what are those qualities for our own mental preparation that could allow us to live without fear. And what these health practitioners were talking about is people who had that sense of curiosity and grand adventure died better deaths than the people who were struggling and fighting and didn't want to let go. And a couple of them talked about how working with end-of-life care and patients who were, imminently transcending, was just the conversation. Just the ability to have a conversation with somebody about their dying. Because so many people don't want to talk about it. And so they described, one woman was a nurse and she described having a conversation with this patient. And she said he was a really fussy patient and he was always like ringing the call button. And as a busy nurse, they're like, oh my God, I'm too busy, I've got another patient, I've got all these things. And so she wanted to be with him though. And she wanted to be there for him when he made his transition. Kind of like a midwife. A lot of them think of themselves as midwives. And so she said to him, are you going to die tonight? Because I'm really busy. And I have this other patient in the next room who really needs me. But if you're going to die tonight, I will be right back here by your side. And he said, no. And so he went to sleep, and he slept a very sound night, and she was able to be there for him the next day when he made his transition. So that's another interesting thing, is people choosing that moment. And that's a piece that we don't talk about if we're completely in denial and not going there. But we have intention. And we can bring that intention to imbue all aspects of our life. So, you Miss Multitasker over there. Anybody else?
I think this is just like moving house to house. And we practice meditation because we want to stop we want to quit the moving around.
That's beautiful. Louisa Tish, who you saw a little bit of, talks about in her Yoruban tradition, she comes from an African tribal culture. And they talk about it's the great marketplace. And so you come into this life, you go to the marketplace, you go out, you rest, you come back into the marketplace, you go out, you rest. And again, the Deepak piece, I really love his expression. It's the off between the ons. It's a very kind of tangible way. A lot of what's happening and where we'll end the movie is in the emergence of a new story. And I'd like to talk about how I feel we're alive at a time between stories. That there is no definitive one story that is defining all of reality in the 21st century. And that on the one hand, we now have access to the world's spiritual traditions, the wisdom traditions, the lineage lines. And on the other hand, we have these discoveries that are coming out of science, like quantum mechanics. And quantum physics is very interesting because it is about a non-linear approach. And so you think about what got the Apollo astronauts to the moon was a linear, predictive Newtonian physics. It worked. It works. It works. And at the same time, we're discovering quantum physics works. And we're even demonstrating it in laboratories at macroscopic levels. So how do we live with the paradox of the world's wisdom traditions, Newtonian physics, quantum mechanics, and what is it that would lead somebody like Rudy Tanzi, who's in this film? He's a senior professor at Harvard Medical School. He specializes in Alzheimer's. He doesn't believe our identity is stored in the brain. well, this is fascinating. He's like the epitome of like the materialistic, physicalistic science. So I think that this is a unique moment in human history when we actually have these different truth systems coming together in ways that can invite creativity. And in that creativity may invite breakthrough. So thank you for your metaphor, the beautiful metaphor of the houses. I'll remember that. So it's about 5 till. Oh, okay, great.
So before you said that we undergo noetic experiences to realize epiphanies that help us catalyze our transformations in consciousness, can you explain that? Like, is the process of realizing the epiphany, is it something spontaneous, or do we actually undergo certain practices beforehand and then realize our...
I think that's an excellent question. Thank you. I think it's both. I think that people have these kind of spontaneous experiences that they didn't predict. Sometimes, like Simon Lewis was talking about being in a coma, and his experience in the coma state was a guide came to him, took him by the hand and said, "It isn't your time," and led him out of the death experience, the deep coma experience. Well, he, upon waking, felt very certain it was his wife. But his wife had been killed in the car accident that put him in the coma. And so the experience he had wasn't something that was scheduled or practiced. But since then, he's developed a practice. And so I think it's both about being awake to all of those wonderful, magical moments that happen in our lives that can give us the glimmer of something else. And it's also about developing practice that can allow greater, I don't want to use the word control. I guess that's the only word I can come up with right now. And again, somebody can help me with better language. But it's our ability to, it's like what Starhawk said. My practice triggers my epiphanies trigger my practice. And so how do we hold that it's a both and? And I think the more people practice, the more you cultivate that sense of unity of consciousness, the more we can stay in that sense of real deep appreciation for impermanence, the easier it's going to be to have these kinds of experiences. So there was one more, and then I know we need to end on time. Let's see.
This doesn't really relate, but I've just been curious about this for like a long time, but what are dreams exactly, and why do we dream them?
I think that's a great mystery. And again, I want to say one of the most powerful tools of transformation is living in the mystery, not thinking we have to answer everything. We know that there are neurobiological things happening in the brain. They have to do with the way the brain is firing that allow us to integrate and synthesize experiences from our day. But there's also a way in which this kind of non-ordinary state of consciousness, where we've shut off all the sensory input, allows us the potential to experience other dimensions. So just going back to Fariba Bogdaran, she was working with a man named Stephen LaBerge, and they were studying these lucid dreams. Lucid dreams are when you're dreaming and you become aware that you're dreaming, and you actually have the power to change the course of the dream. And this is a practice, and I bet we practice it here. So she was studying the neurophysiology of lucid dreaming, and she had this thought: if people are able to become conscious in the middle of a dream, can we invite them to have an experience of the divine? And so she asked these lucid dreamers to do this when they went to sleep at night, to set the intention that they were going to experience the divine. And they woke up the next day, and she said to them, well, what was your experience like? And they said, wow. And here she is, a scientist, and she's looking for some data, and wow just didn't cut it. And so she was trying to figure out how to find a language that would allow these people to describe the nature of their inner experience. And she had this idea to take them to these huge canvases of these artists who had painted the interconnectedness of the universe. There were these big, enormous, the size of that screen, these big canvases. And so she had them sit down and meditate in front of these beautiful paintings. and then to try and describe the nature of their own dream, their dream experience. And suddenly, because they were talking about that painting out there, they were able to find language to describe their own experience of these profound transcendent moments. So dreams are a great mystery. We know certain things about how the neurophysiology works about dreaming, but we certainly don't know anything about, the content or the symbolism. I don't know anything. I think different people can calibrate their own knowing. But I think that my takeaway and my final words are, to the extent we can stay in that profound gratitude for the mystery and be open to whatever the possibilities are for, what dreams may tell us about ourselves and our path. To that extent, we are closer to liberation. So I know that it's time, and I somehow managed to fill the moments. So I thank you all for your attention and intention and repetition and guidance.
Share with us a lot more about this dialogue between science and spiritual